Hello, and welcome to Totally Got Out of Bed, a podcast to support you as you cope with the loss of a loved one to suicide. I'm Nora Flum, and I lost my son Eric to suicide on January 3rd of 2018.
And I'm Tony Plant, and I lost my 15-year-old daughter Anna to suicide on January 30th of 2016. Through this podcast, we hope that by sharing our stories with you, will be of some help to others on a similar path. We intend for it to be descriptive and not prescriptive, meaning that we're not experts, and we're not trying to tell you what to do. We just want to tell you what worked for us and what didn't work for us. And because everyone's experience is different, everyone's grief is different. No matter what brings you to this podcast, welcome to the club. We're sorry you're here.
In this episode, we're going to talk about keeping our heads above water, especially that first year. I've talked before about how I felt like the first year, I felt like I was adrift on a feeble raft during a raging storm. I frequently felt overwhelmed by waves of grief, and keeping my head above water was a constant struggle. Eventually, it felt like the storm calmed down a bit, but I was still struggling to keep from drowning. It took a while before I learned the strategies, and I learned how to use the tools in my grief toolbox.
I totally agree. I heard about those tools those first few months, but I had to learn to use them. And as time went on and I was able to utilize those tools a little bit more frequently, I learned that being able to use them was a whole lot easier when I was taking care of myself physically and mentally. So for me, I guess the first thing I had to do was to keep my head above water is to practice good self-care. So at first that was, virtually impossible because it was all you could do to get up in the morning out of bed. But eventually I started realizing that, you needed to do all the things that you normally do to have practice good self-care. And that was like drink enough water, get plenty of sleep, limit your screen time, eat a healthy diet, eliminate or vastly diminish anyway your intake of alcohol, schedule in some physical activity, and get outside. I mean, I know for me, if I don't make sure these things are a priority in my life, my grief relapses, at least now as I've gotten a little further along, are going to be a lot harder to handle, and they're going to last a lot longer. And when I don't practice good self-care, I'm just going to be in a worse place.
Totally understand. When you don't practice good self-care, you're in a worse place. The grief is so heavy, especially at first. I couldn't do anything for myself. It felt like I was in a fog. I was just existing, and life was something that happened around me, and I was just a passive observer. I did not participate. I didn't care. I totally got out of bed most of the time, but I did not live. My friends brought meals, so I ate. I spent most of my time the first few weeks after the funeral coloring in my journal, watching mindless television, and sobbing. You mentioned all kinds of good self-care, and I have to admit I wasn't doing any of it, especially at first. The one thing I did from the very beginning is to go to grief group. You and the others I met at Survivors Resources Support Group for Suicide Survivors were my lifeline. I learned so many tools that helped so much, and I remember the first time I heard you say, "I don't mean to brag, but I totally got out of bed today." It changed the way I looked at my grief, and I started calling you Snarky Tony after that, and you became my hero.
Oh my goodness. That is so sweet, Nora. Thank you. I love being thought of as a snarky hero. My life goal is now accomplished. I'm sure I've been a little snarky my whole life, but I remember when Anna died and I saw that saying, I know God won't give me more than I can handle, but I just wish he didn't trust me so much. And that's exactly how I felt. And, just a little bit snarky. Yeah, I know God's got this and I'm going to get through it and everything. But, still a little snarky about the whole thing. The snarkiness was, for some reason, the real part for me because it adds that touch of, obviously I'm sad, but as you can tell, I'm also more than a little pissed off. And after that, first thing got put in that grief box, that part about God not trusting me so much. I added that next one, which was, I don't mean to brag, but I totally got out of bed. And I sort of started my own little snarky grief toolbox. And since then, I've added plenty of snarky additions. And I call it kind of my grief toolbox, my snarky grief toolbox. But don't get me wrong, I have a regular grief toolbox too. I just also have a snarky one.
I do remember the first time I told somebody else. I have an acquaintance that also lost a son to suicide, and I do remember reaching out to her and giving her some tips that I learned that were helpful. And one of the first things I told her was about Snarky Tony, and the I don't mean to brag, but I totally got out of bed. And she texted back, "You mean that someday I'll get my sarcasm back?" And I said, "Yeah,
Oh gosh,
it'll come
yes, you
back.
will.
It'll come back." So back to the other healthcare or self-care things. I don't remember what motivated me to start trying to increase my activity because I was on the couch all the time. My husband belonged to a boxing gym, and I remember he went whenever he could. And the first time he went right after Eric died, it was within a week, I think. And I went with him just because I couldn't be alone yet. Not that I participated, mind you. I just sat at a table with my coloring pencils and my book and just watched, still feeling very lost and very adrift and very much in the storm. And I think it helped him because he got to go punch something, but I wasn't I wasn't there yet. But I did eventually start going back to the gym. And at first I didn't notice any benefits except that it was one more thing that could distract me from grief. I talked before about calling her my grief baby, and she was loud and active, screaming at me for weeks, months. And when I was coloring and journaling, I felt like I was taking care of her, but it wasn't enough. When I went to the gym, it felt like I was taking a break from her, leaving her with a babysitter, in a sense. And I didn't notice at first, but I started feeling less tired. Grief fatigue is nothing like I had ever experienced, and I don't think I was even aware I had it until I was in the habit of going to the gym every day, and then for some reason I didn't go for a couple of days in a row, and the fatigue came back. I hadn't really paid attention that it was there, and I didn't notice it had lifted until it came back. And when I started working again, when I went back to school, I went back to my pre-trauma schedule, and I used to go to the gym before school. And so I went back, and I have a particular locker I use, and I've become friends with the women who also regularly use the space to get ready. And I had to tell them about my son's death, probably the first time I saw someone who didn't know. It turns out that one of the women I'd known for months had also lost a son to suicide about 8 years before. It's alarming how many people this affects. But again, it's also a relief to know that somebody gets it, somebody understands.
Absolutely. Every time I feel like every time I tell somebody about Anna, it seems like they have some sort of story to tell about someone they know who either struggled with mental health or died by suicide. And it's just so much more common than we think it is. It's such a great reminder that we need to talk about it for so many reasons. It benefits so many people. I even have a friend who I walked with yesterday whose dad died by suicide 30 years ago. And she's been listening to our podcast now, and it still brings this stuff up for her. And so I just think the more we can talk about it, the more it's going to be helpful for everybody. So, speaking of walking, though, physical activity was something that I had done when Anna died for years prior to it. And I was an avid runner at the time, although I was not a long distance runner. I just kind of ran short distances, and sometimes they were only walks. But when she first died, it was really hard for me to run. I really only had the energy to walk. And on the rare occasion when the anger was boiling up, I would run. And I don't think I really even took a break from that schedule except for the week of the funeral. Like I said, I'd been running before work almost every day for like 15 years. So not doing so wasn't really an option. It was much harder though, I'm not going to lie. I mean, I pretty much never, even to this day, and never did ever in my life, jump out of bed screaming, "Yay, I get to go running." That never happens for me. So for me, it's more like if I do this go running or walking thing, I'm going to have a better day. So it's been a struggle any way you look at it, but I've learned after many mistakes and bad days, running or walking at all is better than not doing so. So I was really lucky to have that life experience in my pocket when I joined this horrific suicide loss survivors club. it was like a little insurance that my days could be ever so slightly better if I kept that routine.
Yeah, I've never been an athlete. I've never been a runner. But I had been in the habit of being more physically active for the years leading, for the like 2 or 3 years leading up to Eric's death. And I do think you're right. I do think having that in the routine, having that as a practice before tragedy strikes was important in the recovery after. Um, but yeah, physical activity only went so far to help me. And I remember that months after Eric died, my husband finally broached the subject of my own mental health. He did it very gently, but he did talk about how I was essentially doing nothing at home, and he was right. I had all I could do to make it through a day at school, and when I got home, I all I wanted to do, or all I felt capable of doing, is wrapping in a blanket and lying on the couch. I had nothing left. And for those of you who have to go through a loss to suicide and still have to care for children or siblings or parents, oh my God, you're doing an extraordinary thing. And God bless you. And God grant you the strength to continue to do that. I took care of students, but I did not take care of myself or my husband. Not really. But Matt told me that if he didn't cook, we wouldn't eat. And he was right. So after that, I scheduled an appointment with my doctor. I did the mental health screening. How often do I feel tired? All the time. How often do I feel hopeless? All the time. How often did my symptoms interfere with my work? All the time. The only question I could honestly say never to was, did I have thoughts of hurting myself? And honestly, I wanted to die. I thought, well, if I died now, it would be fine. But I did not have any suicide ideation for myself. I didn't want to hurt myself. Well, my doctor put me on an antidepressant, and I'm one of the lucky ones. I started noticing a difference within days. I started doing tasks around the house, and I started cooking again. I started living again.
Yeah, you're right. I think that those people, back to one of the things you said at the beginning of that statement, those people that have kids and other people they have to care for besides themselves, those people are the true heroes. My son was old enough to take care of himself at the time. He was a senior in high school. And, I just think, oh my gosh, if he had been, 5 or 2, for heaven's sakes, how awful it would have been. I suppose what you do, and is a little bit of what I did, is that, I kind of had to move on for that second child. So if you have other things you have to do, I'm sure you just put one foot in front of the other and the grief just gets pushed further down. That would be just obviously not an expert opinion, but my sort of thought about what would happen. But I was already on antidepressants when Anna died, so I had been for a few years. And I did call my doctor, though, and tell her that I couldn't stop crying. So she upped my dose quite substantially, and that really did help. It gave me the ability to at least, I think, function a little throughout the day. But there's no magic pill to this grief thing, unfortunately. And antidepressant or not, I learned that it mostly just takes a lot of time and work and following directions.
Time and work and following directions, and those are things that when you've got grief brain you don't really think about very easily. It's not, you can't make decisions very easily, and you certainly don't make good decisions about caring for yourself, at least not at first.
So true.
Yeah, so in the fall after school started, I realized I still wasn't doing well, and I started looking for therapy and talking about not being able to advocate for yourself. Grief therapy is really hard to find, and it's hard to get into. If I could wave my magic wand and change one thing about how we help people grieve, it would be that everyone gets a caregiver, because when I started to look for a therapist, I couldn't find anyone that specialized in grief due to suicide loss that was taking patients. One clinic a friend recommended for grief in general had a 6-month waiting list. And after
Yikes.
every no, I just gave up. I'd quit trying because I couldn't think about what the next step could possibly be. But eventually then I'd try again after a bit because I was still floundering. And I finally found a therapist who had some openings. She didn't specialize in grief, but I was hoping that something was better than nothing. She did specialize in EMDR, which I think I heard about first at Grief Group. It's called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I had heard at group that it was especially effective in treating PTSD. And make no mistake, when you lose someone to suicide, you very likely have PTSD. I did. I don't know how the therapy works. I can't even say for sure that it worked for me, I just know that I went to her office, sobbed the whole time, every time, did a little talking, but mostly sobbed. My insurance approved 10 sessions, and after 10 sessions, we did a reassessment. And I wasn't sure it was helping. I felt like I could just as effectively go home and sob for an hour for free rather than go to a therapist for an hour and sob. So I chose not to request more sessions. So I can't really tell you that it worked. I can only tell you that after 10 weeks, I did feel better. I'm not sure if it was because of therapy or it was because of time, but I did sob for 10 straight sessions, and I did get through, and I haven't been back to therapy.
Hmm. Yeah, I also found a grief group, and I couldn't agree more. It's really hard to find resources for grief. It's like I remember like just putting in grief in like some website trying to find stuff, and I just found it hard to find people that were just focused on that or that was one of their main areas of focus. The one thing I did find that fit my schedule was a group at my church, which wasn't at it wasn't the survivor resources group. It was just another support group, and it was for grievers of all kinds, not just suicide loss survivors. It had nationally known grief counselors and experts in the little videos they showed, and it wasn't an end all for suicide loss for certain, but it did answer a lot of questions about grief in general, which I found helpful because I didn't know that much about it prior to losing my daughter. As far as the EMDR, that just fascinates me, Nora. I've not done it, but I do know of people who have done it, and they believe very strongly that it works. But it was interesting because when you were talking about that, I remember that I'm reading this book, and it's called "The Body Keeps the Score." This is not a plug for that book. I know nothing about that. It's an interesting topic for me that your body is keeping the score of all the trauma that happens in your life, which is why I started reading it. And it is truly one of the most interesting books I've ever read. The researcher has done a ton of research on trauma, and he talks about how EMDR was started. Like he was one of the first researchers and therapists that used it. And apparently it's used as an attempt to sort of emulate REM sleep, and how somehow during that part of your sleeping, you're able to deal with and think about the trauma. I have no idea why or how it works. But from a research point of view and the results this author has gotten, it seems definitely worth a try.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that book. The Body Keeps the Score. I haven't read it. Of course, I haven't read hardly anything about grief, so go figure that I haven't read that. But totally. And I think we talked about one of our upcoming episodes. We're going to talk about the physical symptoms and the physical reactions we've had to grief. So yeah, maybe I'll read the book before we do that episode. But the one thing I remember too was grief brain. And I don't know, was grief brain a thing for you? What's the dumbest thing you can remember doing because of grief brain? And
Right.
I remember I forgot to go to Mexico. I was scheduled to present at an international conference. I had booked it about a year before, and so months before Eric died, and I did think about backing out because I couldn't imagine actually planning what I was going to say, planning the conference, pulling myself together enough to present for. It was a week session I was giving a conference on, and I couldn't think about planning that. But I decided that no, it was important. It was a friend of mine that was organized the conference. He asked me to be one of the presenters. Um, and I knew the family well, and it was something that I really wanted to do. Besides that, he'd known Eric and John since they were very young, and he feels like part of our family, or his family is part of my family. And so part of me was just like, I just wanted to go and be with my other family as we were going through this. So yeah, I went ahead and booked the ticket, coordinated with a couple of Minnesota teachers who were going to attend the conference, and completely forgot the date. And one of them texted me one morning on a Saturday. She was texting me at 6 o'clock in the morning for a 7 a.m. flight. At the gate, see you soon. And I was still in bed. Ah, shit. Stupid grief brain. Luckily, I was able to get on a flight the next day. My conference was scheduled to start at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, and like I said, I was the presenter. Well, we had bad weather, and my flight that was supposed to get in to Mexico City at about 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon didn't get in until almost 9 o'clock that night. And because everyone's international flights were delayed for hours, getting through immigration was like a 3-hour ordeal. I finished a Russian novel while I waited in line because When your life is grief because of a suicide, why not read a Russian novel that ends in a suicide? But I finally got through customs at about midnight, and then had to get on a bus to Cuernavaca. I think it was close to 2 o'clock in the morning when I finally got to my friend's house. It was a nightmare.
Oh my gosh. That is a big grief brain oops. I'm glad you finally got there though. But yikes, huh? Grief brain is such a real thing. I've had it since day one and I still have it. At first it was bigger things like not like forgetting what I was doing or why I was somewhere. I would forget where my phone is or what I was supposed to be when I was supposed to be somewhere. But luckily for me, most of my grief brain oopses were easily fixable and they weren't life threatening, of course, but grief brain only proved to make a horrific situation that we were in into a much more horrific situation. It just added to the already horrible tragedy we were living. And what are the things we can do to get through that very realness of grief brain is, sort of a thought that came to mind when I was preparing here. And so first, I suppose we need to admit and realize its existence, because when I think about grief, that's not something I would have thought about as a non-suicide loss survivor. I mean, I didn't even realize that was a thing. So I think just letting people know that if you feel like you're being kind of a ditz, well, you might be, and that's okay. So are we.
Yeah, grief brain is totally a thing, and you have to figure out ways to compensate for it. And I think one of the things that has been working for me is I have to make lists. I never used to be a list maker, but now I have to. I know that there are 6 things I have to do every school day morning. 6. Shower, brush teeth, put my contacts in, put on deodorant, put on makeup, and take my antidepressant. 6. I have to count them or I forget. At the gym, I have 5 things I need before I leave the locker room in order to go work out. In my water bottle, hair binder, headphones, phone, and my phone armband. And now I need 6 because I also need a mask too. I do better when I meal plan and follow it. It's a list, but I'm not always good at following through with that. And I try to do one task at home every day. Dishes, laundry, cook. Not everything gets done very often, but everything gets done at least once a month. And I know that might disturb some people, but my slogan has become, yeah, you could eat off my floor too. I just wouldn't trust anything you'd find there.
Yeah, make lists and possibly lower our expectations of ourselves a little bit. Wise recommendations for anybody. I always tell my husband along those list making ways, I say, take roll call before you leave the house. For example, keys here, reading glasses here, wallet here. It's those little games and ways that we have to come up with ways to get through the day in order to function and at least appropriately, if not successfully.
Amen to that. Function appropriately, if not successfully. Totally got out of bed. And then everything else is gravy, right?
Right, exactly.
And with that, we need to bring this episode to a close. As we begin to think, though, about our future episodes, we are bringing together and going to end this series on getting through the first year sometime soon. We're thinking about changing it up a little bit and asking for guest speakers or asking other people to share their stories. So if you are listening and you have an idea, you have a resource, you have a story that you would like to share, please email us. Please message us through Facebook or email us at totallygotoutofbed@gmail.com. We would like to hear from you as we continue to plan beyond the first series that we're doing is getting through the first year. Remember that if you or someone you know is in immediate danger, go to the nearest emergency room, call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-TALK, or text HELLO to 741-741. Those are numbers that people will monitor and will get back to you, so you'll get a trained therapist or a trained counselor at least in an urgent situation, or do a search for a mobile crisis response team in your area. Again, for more information about Totally Got Out of Bed, visit totallygotoutofbed.com. That's one word. You can find episodes there or look for us wherever you get your podcasts. And please pass on this page and our podcast to your family, to your friends. Share your comments and ideas with us. We'd like to hear from you. Visit our Facebook page. Find us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and hopefully wherever you get your podcasts.
And as always, we'd like to thank our talented team, Wendy Wolf, our technological genius, Monica Lavorsi, the composer and performer behind our theme song, Hold My Hand Now, and a special thank you to Survivor Resources, the group that continues to support us and others in the wake of our tragedies. Thank you for listening today. Please join us for our next episode when we'll continue our series on getting through the first year by asking the question, where does help come from? We'll talk about what others did that helped us get through the first year. In the meantime, smile when you can and cry when you have to, and do totally try to get out of bed.
Hold my hand now. Hold my hand now. Hold my hand now and be as one. The colors start to fade. Gray is the only shade that you see now. Lost in the charade of the journeyman's parade, can't see a way out. As you keep marching onward, oh, all you gotta do is reach out and hold my hand now. Hold my hand now. Hold my hand now. Hold my hand now and be as one. Hold my hand now. Hold my hand. The tracks begin to sway. You're in the middle of the fray, so hold on tight now. Your grip begins to slip. You tumble towards the lip of the open train and how